atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this morning?
I was 12% better than I was earlier this week. But
Okay. All right. Well, before...
roughly, yeah.
Rough. Well, before we get going, I do a few thank yous. First off, Kyle, longtime listener, supporter, for increasing his level of support and giving us a generous additional one-time donation on Venmo. Thanks also to Robert, Jennifer, Heather, and Jesse. They're all longtime Patreon supporters who also recently increased their support levels, as well as Mary, who recently supported us with a generous one-time donation through PayPal. Thank you all very much. We really do appreciate it. It helps out tremendously. All right. So,
Harvesting losses is what you call it, I think, sometimes in the
harvesting
market. But go ahead.
Okay. So before we do get started, I want to mention that last week, during Trey and Ken's discussion of President Trump's so-called Liberation Day tariffs, they wondered whether Hungary was included in tariffs. And folks might recall Ken tried to find them on the list. Well, the reason they weren't there is, of course, Hungary would come under the EU 20% tariffs that Trump announced. The other thing I wanted to mention, they wondered why Russia wasn't on that list, even for the baseline 10% tariffs. Ken suggested it's because Trump has shady ties to Russia. I honestly think the simpler and much more likely explanation is that Trump wants to use that as leverage in the Ukraine peace negotiations. Though that's not the White House's explanation. According to Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, she said, well, we don't really have any meaningful trade with Russia anyway because of the current sanctions in place. And, that's not exactly true. We do have kind of minimal trade with Russia, I guess you could say. Over $500 million in exports, around $3 billion in imports last year. But there are a bunch of countries with far, far more minimal trade that the president hit with tariffs. I mean, Fiji, we do not have a lot of, you probably didn't know this, or you probably did know this, Jay. We don't have a lot of trade.
Well, we've been losing a lot of jobs to Fiji.
There you go. They got that 32% tariff. We only export like 158 million to them. And you get my point, right? And so I just wanted to mention that, as well as, that other thing as well. So, but speaking of tariffs, Jay, we've got a lot to talk about. And most folks know the lead up to this. I mean, in response to markets absolutely cratering after that Liberation Day worldwide tariff announcement on April 2nd, President Trump this week put a 90-day pause on the so-called reciprocal parts of his worldwide tariff regime. And, multiple administration officials, supporters, say, well, this is Trump, art a deal, 8-dimensional chess. But the president himself called this narrative into question, saying, well, traders are getting a little bit yippy, a little bit afraid, and hey, you have to have flexibility. So there you go. And then after that, of course, we saw that brief market rally, but then President Trump continued to escalate the trade war with, I think we're infinity plus one, the tariffs, 145%. And so, gold is up, the dollar, which is typically seen as a safe haven during times of financial instability, the dollar is down. So crazy times. And this 90-day delay will presumably allow countries to attempt to negotiate a lower rate. But at this point, that 10% base global tariff is still in place, along with 25% tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, and auto parts, as well as, yes, that 145% tariff on China. And when the president was asked how he determined which countries might get exemptions, he said, you almost can't take a pencil to paper. It's really more of an instinct, I think, than anything else. Yeah.
Depends on the day you catch me.
And I think the Wall Street Journal, their editorial board yesterday put it really well. They said the reality is that Mr. Trump is making it up as he goes along, and it would help if he had an actual strategy to deal with China in particular. Finally, I wanted to mention there's also been a legal challenge to some of the tariffs, and there are more being considered. The one that's been filed is actually done so by a conservative civil liberties group called the New Civil Liberties Alliance, in part funded
Friends
by,
of mine, in fact, Mike.
Charles Koch. I mean, you hang out on the yacht with the Koch brothers all the time. But
no, I've worked with the New Civil Liberties Alliance, and I've been a counsel for them. A local counsel helped out on occasion.
There you go.
And,
I mean, you're all about liberty and freedom, so it doesn't surprise me. You know?
John Vecchione, who's and for those who don't also realize, New Civil Liberties Alliance was one of the driving organizations in the Loper Bright case and the overturning Chevron. So.
Which makes sense in this context, which we'll get to. But because in the complaint, they allege a bunch of things, that the authority that President Trump asserted to impose the China tariffs, that International Economic Emergency Powers Act, it doesn't actually authorize tariffs. And even if it did, the statute only authorizes measures that are necessary to address a specific emergency, which a blanket tariff on all Chinese goods wouldn't do. And also that President Trump has said multiple times isn't the actual motive for the tariffs. They also claim that the tariffs violate the major questions doctrine and the non-delegation doctrine as well, because there's no intelligible principle guiding the president's use of this tariff power. And finally, Jay, you can't have a lawsuit against the Trump administration without an Administrative Procedures Act violation allegation. And so there's one there as well. And that's actually where I wanted to start with, that question of legality. So what do you think about the arguments made in the lawsuit?
Well, I like I said, John's a friend. I think they're sort of the same arguments that I raised a couple weeks ago, right, on the authority question. They're better written out and better thought out than what I was doing, kind of shooting from the hip on the show. But no, I think that's exactly a problem, and I think this is a good space for conservatives or classical liberals, as we might now call ourselves, to be, right. That this is the more standard, good old fashioned free trade Reaganite type position, and against what would appear to be as again the Wall Street Journal editorial board, who follows me, would point out sort of arbitrary executive actions. So I think they're right. I think this is a good case. I'm glad someone is bringing it. Much as I will raise the flag for a unitary executive and executive power where that's appropriate. For example, in running the executive branch, Congress or the Constitution does delegate these kind of questions to Congress. And when we're talking about slapping sanctions on the or tariffs on the entire world unilaterally without congressional action, I think that is a major question. And I think there's a good argument that the president has not checked the boxes to.
And just to go back on
to meet whatever standard he might under an emergency type thing where it was delegated.
Yeah, and just to go back on that, for folks who might need a refresher on that, the major question doctrine was what was announced first by the court in West Virginia versus EPA in 2022. And the idea is that in instances where the president or the executive is doing something that would have major significant political, economic ramifications, that the administration has to point to clear congressional authorization to do that. And the assumption is going to be they can't unless it's there. And if you read the IEEPA, which I have done several times in the last few days, it does say the president can investigate, regulate, or prohibit transactions in foreign exchange, but it says nothing about imposing tariffs. And also, I mentioned that thing about dealing with unusual and extraordinary threats. So I think, to me, like you said, Jay, on the major question,
running a trade deficit is not unusual or extraordinary.
Exactly. And so I guess the thing that's surprising to me in part, and this lawsuit was filed on the 3rd, so right after, that there haven't been more. But then again, I know more are in the works, but I guess you want to make sure you pick the right case and everything's lined up and that sort of thing. But
Well,
also,
I think there is also, with these type of suits, one of the biggest barriers or the biggest problem, and this happened a lot during the COVID suits, it happened with student loan stuff, is making sure that you've got a plaintiff who has standing. And so I think in those, that's why maybe, because if I'm the government and defending this suit, I think that's my first defense. I say, look, well, who are you guys? How have you been harmed by this? Well, we can't buy this, or it's more expensive. And, at that point, it's like, well, get out of here. So you have to have an individualized harm, right? And so I think that might be the question. Can I also say just on the major questions doctrine, it was announced in West Virginia versus EPA, but it was kind of lurking out there before. It was kind of like a anti-Chevron light. I look, and the quote, because I want to use the quote that this is sort of based on, and it grew out of, it was a line from Justice Scalia talking about delegation of powers to the administrative state. And Scalia, in the way that only he can say it, said, look, Congress doesn't hide elephants in mouse holes.
Yeah, I know you love that one. It's a good one. It's a good one.
It is. Yeah. It is. But I think it's one of those, it captures exactly what we're talking about. If Congress intends to delegate a big power, they do so bigly, so to speak. And you make clear it's not something hidden in the fine print or the text or the and take other appropriate action clause type thing, right? That you tack on at the end.
I'd say, and not only that, of course, but there are some of the tariffs that even if you would say that the president has the power to do these things, like if you have to cite the reason for the emergency, which President Trump has done.
Right. You still have to go through the exercise and check the boxes.
But so the fentanyl for China and for Mexico. And of course, Canada, all the, geez, right. You could probably find more fentanyl at like 2 square blocks around my house than you can, in all of Canada. But anyway, the point being is that for the other countries, what he cited was the trade deficit. So then that you'd have a hard time linking that to putting a tariff on countries with which we have a trade surplus. I'm just saying, but
well,
yeah,
and
so
also I'm.
Go ahead.
Man, this just goes back to maybe I'm getting into arguing the case too much, but we have a trade deficit because we buy a lot of stuff. We have a lot of people who buy a lot of stuff, and that's not a bad thing, And again, in matching up against most any other, against Fiji, for example, of course, we buy more stuff than the Fijians do from us, and. Yeah, there's another question as far as just in basic economics, right? Is a trade deficit necessarily a bad thing? I think it can be, but I don't know that just the mere fact of you're running alone that you're running a trade deficit is an indicator of poor economic health. In a lot of cases, sometimes it's an indicator of strong economic health and that you have a strong currency, and which makes your goods more expensive other places, that sort of thing. But I derailed you. Sorry.
No, I'm saying it sounds like we agree that we highly question his ability to even do this legally. And it wouldn't surprise me if a whole bunch of people just sort of hope that some federal judge will bail the country out essentially at this point, and that Republicans won't have to act as they have been sort of making very sort of tentative gestures toward with various legislation that's kind of creeping up around the edges here. So go ahead, Bill.
Yeah. Well, the Senate pushed back. There was a minor little Senate pushback on the Canadian stuff a week or so ago. But I think that cases like this are important, if not for the, do we get a district judge who rules in our favor and issues a nationwide injunction, which that's, nationwide injunctions, that's a different thing. And we talked about that last week, 2 weeks ago, whatever. But it's important to raise the flag, all right? Just to have, a lot of times a lawsuit will give a hook to make those public policy arguments on. when no one else is making them. So I think that's also a valuable purpose, even beyond which, if you get the relief you want, you get the relief you want. But I think it's good and appropriate for conservatives to always push back on the bounds of, the administrative state, and to always have some sort of questioning of arbitrary government power.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's your take on why, well, one narrative is that President Trump blinked because the markets were going down way too much, and the bond market scared the hell out of him, and I think rightly so. Or do you think this is really, 12-dimensional Trumpian chess?
I do think there may be more than just blinking. The way he did it, the way he, kept the tariffs on China, I think there may be a plan. I'm not sure it's a good plan, right? But I think that this is the we're going to raise this issue. We're going to, get all crazy and get everyone concerned, and then say, oh, all right, let's calm down.
That's what I think the plan is.
It's negotiating by negotiating by brinksmanship, right?
Yes, and not only that,
and that, like I said, that may not be a good plan. And also, I tend to think in terms of when you're using brinksmanship type tactics, it ought to equate to I don't know, big enough issue that justifies those tactics. I don't think our trade relationship with Canada does. Look, and for the MAGA folks out there, I think you could make a good argument that, hey, you know what, maybe we ought to take a look at if we're getting a fair shake in our trade relationship with the rest of the world, because there are a lot of these sort of hidden tariffs, hidden taxes, state supports, that sort of thing that amount to tariffs, and and maybe we aren't getting a fair deal, but it's not national emergency kind of stuff. It is more of the, geez, I probably paid more for that than I should have, but is it a national emergency that we're shutting down industries because of it? No. Is it dumping into U.S. markets of goods? No. And there's sort of a remedy for that already. Again, it's not necessarily a easy fix, easy remedy, but that's not what we're talking about. So that's where I am. That I think the problem needs to justify the tactics, and I don't know that that's where we are. But if you think in sort of Trump world, the Trump, there is the kind of go big or go home, right? You blow everything up and see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I would think that more than anything else, Donald Trump just loves to be the center of attention and loves to have people coming to him as supplicants. And so here we go. He's got now, 90 days to this is beautiful for him. Right. And of course, it's horrible for markets and for, the rest of the world. But if it's beautiful for Trump, then, by the transitive property, it must be beautiful for everyone else. And if it's not beautiful for you, then you're obviously suffering from TDS or something like that. But I take your point about what sort of a deal are we getting? And I actually dug into that. Clearly, 145%. I agree with China on this. That rate is a joke, right? So, but a fair tariff rate, if you consider China's tariffs on U.S. goods, as well as their non-tariff barriers, and as well as, our non-tariff barriers and back and forth and so forth, I think you can make a good case for something in the maybe high 20s to low 30s. If you want to add in their massive IP theft, and we're talking like $400 billion a year is a conservative estimate. Okay. If you wanted to add all of that in, well, you could argue for a tariff of like in the 80s to low 90s. But of course, that would be nuts because it would defeat the purpose. But I would say if President Trump said, you know what, given all that China's doing, we're going to throw a 30% tariff on that, and it's going to keep on going up until they deal in a meaningful way with their intellectual property theft and other barriers, I'd say, well, I might not necessarily agree with that, but it's not this insane schoolyard sort of tit for tat ridiculousness that we have now. And so I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah. So, I've argued over for this on a number of our prior shows is that, to the classical liberal conservative Milton Friedman, Adam Smith mind, what you'd want is sort of a tariff-free world. You'd want sort of universal free trade. To the extent that's not the world we live in, and to the extent that you need to flex your muscles to get to that point, tariffs can be an appropriate tool. With you, if you've got a bad actor like China, which, as you said, the IP theft, the other, all the other things that, the state support, the non-tariff barriers, all those things. Yeah, I think when you're having those fights, and if your goal is not protectionism, right, but the opposite of protectionism, you want to get down to a free trade and stop someone else's protectionism, tariffs can be an appropriate tool. But applied across the board to the entire world, that doesn't particularly make sense. There was a good Wall Street Journal piece mentioning something that Trump had said in a speech during his first term, and wondering, like, well, why can't we do that? Which was, look, here's the tariffs. This is before he blinked. But listen, if anybody who wants to agree that we're going to have a zero tariff relationship, free trade, pick up the phone, call me, and the tariffs are off. And that sort of let's move to a free tariff. Now, can you do that in the practical world? Just say, okay, no more tariffs? No, because there's a whole lot of other things that figure into that. As you said, there's state subsidies, there's non-tariff barriers, there's regulations that, when I say non-tariff barriers, those are regulations and other practices, right? That essentially they're not tariffs, but they make it more expensive for you to sell into that country. There was one of the famous case, the EU on the banana thing, about there was a regulation that regulated the curvature of bananas that could be sold within the EFU because you don't need the EU, because you don't want to get a too curvy banana. And it was weird because the EU said, no, it's not true. It didn't happen. No, it's not true. But you could look it up. I mean, it was on the books. Those are non-tariff barriers. So what I'm saying is, it's not something that can be done or undone in just a phone call. But I think that is the healthier instinct. And if we do feel we're being treated unfairly, maybe that's okay. Let's start making those phone calls and having those conversations.
Yeah, except if we do feel we're being treated unfairly, the idea that you should
very, very unfairly.
Well, yeah, that you should settle it with a phone call, but from one autocrat to another, I think that's a big part of the problem. Because if you put yourself in the position of a company that either manufactures in China or uses goods manufactured in China, which is, most companies, right? You say, well, okay, Donald Trump can do this with a wave of his hand. So, of course, the next president could do whatever they want with the wave of their hand. And then you say,
Xi Jinping could do it with a wave of his hand.
Well, yeah.
But like when we're talking, that's why I said you can't really do it with a phone call because there's other
complications
finish. Involved. Like with Canada, there'd have to be, you actually have to have regulatory action and probably some statutory stuff on both sides. But we've done it before, and it was called NAFTA. And
so what I meant, Jay, is that the whole problem is that this can happen with or without a phone call. Donald Trump thinks, as the emperor of the United States, he can just, put these tariffs in place, which, okay, he can, and hopefully that will find it out and that'll be resolved. But my point being is, if you're in the position of a business that, is either using Chinese goods or in China, which is most businesses, then you say, well, Donald Trump can do this, then the next president can just as easily undo it. So why exactly would I go ahead and make these massive moves to try to change all my supply chains to reshore when I don't know what the future is going to be like? And, oh, by the way, manufacturing wages in the U.S. are somewhere around like 6 to 8 times more than in China. And so even if businesses do reshore some of this, there's going to be a strong incentive for them to automate a lot more of that. So it seems to me that what we would get, even in a best case scenario, is not a whole lot of jobs, but lower economic growth and higher inflation. And boy, that seems like a really bad deal, especially given that, Donald Trump has taken an economy that was the envy of the world a few months ago, practically, and he's doing a fantastic job of running it directly into a ditch.
So I would tend to agree with you on all that, which is sort of why I pointed and mentioned that NAFTA, right? That if you're going to make these changes, you do them statutorily. It's long-term policy. It's not going to change overnight. It's you know, you can build a reliance interest into it. So, and it's also if you look at this, take a step back, it makes sense why the president's powers on these issues are limited to emergencies. The idea being that Congress, can't convene and get legislation done overnight. But if there is an emergency, you need to have an executive branch that can address it. That all makes sense and is in conformance with the Constitution and the balance of powers and the separation of powers in the Constitution. But this sort of making trade policy on the fly when there's no emergency, it runs the risk of exactly what you mentioned. That, and we've said this a whole bunch of times, but it always bears saying again, especially to our liberal listeners. I think businesses hate uncertainty, and they may not like regulation, but if there's certainty in the regulation, they're okay. They can deal with it, right? The idea is you can always pass on the cost to somebody else. It's the uncertainty and not knowing what comes down the pike that's really harmful, because what that prevents you from doing is making those investments for the future or figuring out how you're going to allocate what you're doing in the future.
Any predictions on how this plays out? Do you expect 90 days from now that we're going to see, or even we'll take the rest of the world and then we can take China separately, because clearly that's become a separate thing. So on those tariffs on the rest of the world, you think 90 days from now they're gone because of a successful? Well, at this point, it would probably be it would be an injunction, I would imagine, because you wouldn't have a case decided. Or what do you think is going to happen with those? That's my hope. I think, but
yeah, I think Trump will. Which is, again, this is also a problem then for the litigants, right? If Trump's put it on hold, you go to court, you say, I need an injunction right away, and like, well, why? It's suspended.
Well, at least in this case, it's only on the China tariff, so I think that's still good to go. But you're right for others.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's okay. Good point there. But I think there's going to be more saber rattling, more Trump talking about America being treated very unfairly by all these folks, and I think then there will be some small deal making done, right, and then the tariffs will go away, or we will go back to the pre-tariff regime on the rest of the world. I think as he'll throw his fit. I think as you said, there's sort of people will bend the knee or not, and just politically, right? I think enough Americans will say, look, there are a lot of reasons why we elected Donald Trump, and maybe one of them might be to stand up to China, but it wasn't to stand up to Canada. Right. And so there's a lot of things that the Trump voters and Republicans and MAGA voters can say, listen, yeah, we're maybe getting treated unfairly on this. But this is not what we signed up for. It was a trade war with our allies. If we want to sit down and try to negotiate something better, maybe we ought to. And look, in the mind there is of some in MAGA world, there is this sense, and they might not be wrong entirely, that in order to get the attention of these other nations, you have to do this, because we've tried let's sit down and talk, let's get together, hey, see ya in Davos, all that kind of stuff. But it hasn't brought in the results that we would hope, and what we need to do is to do this, blow up everything to get everyone's attention, and then we'll get some action done.
And to be clear, you're not agreeing with that fundamental premise that the balance of trade problem is this national huge emergency that we have to blow up. You're saying that's how MAGA world might see it.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think so. MAGA world looks at this, and they're right that this is not. They're not imagining this, right? That we did have this manufacturing economy that has diminished and diminished and diminished for the past 40, 50 years. well, let's say 40, because I don't know that you can really compare the whole, halcyon days of the 50s and 60s, which I think is maybe what some do. With that was sort of a weird aberration, right, in world history, just because of the rest of the world was destroyed and we were not. But I think there's not going to be the appetite to continue this economic stuff, but there's a problem, right, that we've lost this manufacturing. I don't know that the reason we've lost it or the way to do it to fix the problem is through tariffs.
Yeah, definitely not. I would say. It
I mean,
seems to me
I think,
yeah.
I mean, this is going to sound weird. I think the solution is to manufacture something else or provide services. And it's something that, it's a matter of, listen, somebody else can do this cheaper than we can. So let's find something that the other countries can't do and build that, make that. And if it's one thing that the Americans are good at, it's ingenuity. It's finding those new opportunities.
That's why the Chinese are stealing all that intellectual property from us.
Well, exactly. No, I mean, true. That's exactly, you're right.
No.
So
I think in a way, the best possible outcome for Donald Trump here would be if the courts invalidate all of these tariffs or practically all of these tariffs, because then he could say, well, I did this and it didn't. Those bastards on the court, those liberal judges, it works right into his whole grievance thing. Everyone's against me. And then he'll also be prevented from wrecking the economy. It's a win-win, so, and it's weirdly the thing I'm hoping for. So I don't know. We'll figure. All right. Anything else on tariffs before we move on, Jay?
I don't think so. No.
Okay. Well,
I'm tariffed out for the week.
I'm kind of tariffed out myself. Let's talk about energy. Donald Trump, it's no secret, Donald Trump loves fossil fuels, right? Drill, baby, drill, all that. And he once again demonstrated his great love for them for executive actions on April 8th. And they try to do a bunch of things to sort of bolster the fossil fuel fuel industry more generally, but particularly the beautiful clean coal industry, which is literally in the title of one of them. Also, they kind of assert federal authority over states when it comes to energy policy. The coal one, it designates coal as a mineral, which, by the way, it's not, but, okay. I guess if you're the president, you get to do that.
Yeah,
but,
it comes out of the ground. It's like a rock.
Whatever.
But
anyway, the reason they did that is that designation allows for certain special legal regulatory treatment. And if coal is designated a critical mineral, which Trump has said the Secretary of Interior, I believe, should look into, it can make it easier to approve permitting for plants, open up more subsidies, minimize some environmental regulations, that sort of thing. And when he signed the order, Trump was surrounded by a bunch of hard hat wearing coal miners, said, we're bringing back an industry that was abandoned. We're going to put the miners back to work. And if you're wondering, coal is still the third leading source of energy production in the U.S., but it's only around 9% of the total, according to government data. That's well behind petroleum at 38%, natural gas 36%. Nuclear and renewables are both like coal at right around 9% or so. And as late as 2003, coal actually accounted for over 50% of total U.S. energy production, and been a steep decline for a lot of factors. One obvious one, the fracking boom of the 2000s, tighter environmental regulations, especially during the Obama administration. You got a bunch of aging coal plants that folks are just saying, well, let's just move on from that. And also the cost of renewables has just sunk so much. And even at its peak in 2011, the U.S. had around 92,000 coal miners, and that's around 40,000 now. So there aren't exactly that many jobs to save here, but there you go. And that second order, I mentioned there were a number of them. The second order calls for a 1-year expiration date for all existing energy regulations unless they're actively extended, as well as a requirement that all new energy regulations sunset after 5 years unless those regulations are deregulatory in nature. And then there's a third big one that basically targets climate laws in a number of states, including New York, California. It calls on the Attorney General to identify illegal, unconstitutional state laws that in any way burden energy production. And then there's one on the electric grid, security and stability, figuring out where we're getting power reserve issues and build up those margins, and also would allow the Secretary of the Interior to, I believe it's Interior, or Energy, to prevent decommissioning or conversion of old plants if it would reduce power generation in sort of an at-risk region. So, Jay, that's a lot of fossil fuel boosterism. What do you think about it?
So for the most part, in most of those orders seem to be aimed at what I just talked about a minute ago, providing that certainty or predictability. So I think businesses will like that. I don't think they're necessarily out and out, prop up subsidy type things. But listen, coal is important to our economy. And there is a national security interest in having enough energy reserves and keeping the grid going. I know there've been issues that you mentioned, sort of the decommissioning, the aging coal plants, and there are a lot of these companies and communities that have pushed into sort of a hard place, right? Where, look, we have this old plant, we need to still use it. It will cost this much to fix it up, to make it run on natural gas. That may or may not, there may be regulatory hurdles there. Again, these are things that take years and cost millions and tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars sometimes. But the same token, we need to still have energy running. Can we build a new coal plant? No, we can't do that either. So I think there needs to be some regulatory sanity so that our energy production keeps pace with our energy needs. And our energy needs are big and getting bigger, thanks in part to things like AI and that sort of thing that suck up a lot of resources. In Ohio, this is kind of a good news, bad news thing. At the beginning of the year or late last year, there was a big concern that there would be enough energy production to support things like all of the investment that was going to be flowing into Central Ohio through the CHIPS Act, right? Intel was supposed to build a big plant. Microsoft was going to be involved. It was a huge thing. This was going to be the biggest employer ever in the history of Ohio. And, there were some concerns about, are we going to have the power to keep the lights on? Again, the good news, bad news is Intel's pulled out. Microsoft has announced it's pulled out. It's sort of unclear what's going to happen next. And I think there's probably a lesson for another show about government industrial policy and subsidies and all that sort of thing. But my point is, a lot of communities, a lot of states are looking at this energy crunch coming and need to make sure that they're shored up. And anything that can provide more certainty, more predictability in the energy markets, I think is helpful.
I guess I'll start by saying that, first off, there is no such thing as clean coal. That's a PR term. It's not a real thing. Coal is easily the most damaging in multiple ways of all of the major fossil fuels.
There is cleaner coal.
Yeah, sure. That's like saying, a lower tar cigarette. It's fine.
Yes, yeah.
But it's the dirtiest fossil fuel, and clean coal is just like a BS PR kind of term. It basically means coal with better emissions control for the most part. But I'll also say that I'll start with the parts of those four actions that are, as always, with Donald Trump. There's almost always something, it seems, that's either illegal or unconstitutional. And here again, we find a blanket 1-year expiration mandate for existing energy regulations that would completely bypass the Administrative Procedures Act, which, by the way, requires a procedure not just for creating rules, but amending and repealing them as well. And so I'm fairly certain that one particular order won't actually hold up in court. But as for propping up...
I think you're right on the process, but on the merits, where are you on it?
Well, on the merits, I just wonder, why prop up an energy source that's inherently dirty, doesn't create many jobs, and is considerably more expensive now than wind or solar? That to me makes no sense at all. That's such backwards sort of thinking. I mean, right now, per kilowatt hour. Coal costs somewhere between 8 and 14 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas solar and wind are between 2 to 5 cents. It's clear where the future is in this. And that's where I think we should be putting our focus, our money. And of course, I've made the argument for a long time that we need to focus a lot more on nuclear, because I get the argument. The biggest problem with renewables, of course, is that they're not as reliable. And you got to that point. And if we focus on renewables plus batteries and storage, well, that leads into issues with rare earths and reliance on China and the countries we're trying to tariff to death, and so that's a problem. But nuclear really helps to bridge that because there are fewer supply chain issues with nuclear. And obviously it's a lot more reliable. And the current generation 3 plus reactors, well, let's say current, the design's still like 30, 40 years old. They're way safer. And, we were doing some demonstration projects on generation 4 plant, and those are much safer and better still. And I think that's where we should be putting our resources into making generation 4 plants a reality. I mean, that's the sort of energy policy I can get behind, not something like this that is so incredibly backward looking and bad in so many ways. But I guess Donald Trump doesn't like nuclear and renewables because they're coded left or something like that.
So that's sort of an unusual thing because the left typically hasn't liked nuclear power.
I guess you're right. The nuclear thing. Yeah. Anything that's clean, I suppose, that's an alternative to fossil fuels. You might be right.
Yeah. And can I just say what you said a while back about the coal, the dirtiest fossil fuel? What a great slogan that would be.
Yeah.
That may just like turn it around. You know what I mean? It's like, it's like the bad boy of fossil fuels. If I was like the Coal Marketing Association, I would totally sign up for that. I would call Mike and I would say, Mike, we want to trademark that line. But no, I agree with you on the nuclear stuff. It, to some extent with the renewables, why is the price been going down? Partly technology, partly subsidies. But I guess here's, and I agree with you on the procedural stuff, right? This is on the APA. Trump has a tendency not to check the boxes and do those sort of things that he's supposed to do. But on the merits, I still think it's generally a good policy. Or let's put it this way: I'm not as alarmed by it as you are, to the extent that there could be more production, more, dare I say, deregulation, right, on nuclear stuff to promote that. I'd be for that too.
Yeah, there certainly is a lot of room on that, but that's a politically a lot tougher thing to do. I've seen some estimates that suggest that unnecessary regulation adds around a third to the cost of nuclear power plant generation. And say we're really behind the curve here. I mean, the U.S. still has more nuclear reactors.
It's a little tough to say like unnecessary regulation and nuclear power in the same sentence, right?
But it isn't, and that's the thing. I understand people get completely freaked out after a Fukushima or something like that. But when you look at total costs in terms of human health and wellness over time, you'll find that coal has killed so many more people than nuclear would ever. It's not even close. It's not even close. I mean, for those miners, right? The black lung. But my point is that there are opportunities here to kind of go into the future, and countries like South Korea and China and Russia, they're ahead of us on this. They're actually doing a demonstration generation 4 reactor in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. But I mean, there are other countries that are actually running some of these things. And that's where I'd like to see us out in front on some of this stuff, as opposed to looking back. And so I guess I understand what you're saying. I have a problem with coal just because it's such a dirty fuel. And I have far more concerns about the climate than I think you do. And not only that, but just what coal mining does to the landscape, what it does to the people who actually mine the coal. It's bad in a lot of ways, but I understand the economic importance to, certain communities for sure.
Yeah. Well, if you remember, there was back during the Obama administration, there was the line of, I want to bankrupt the coal industry. And I think that's a bad place for the government to be in, saying they want to bankrupt any industry. So Yeah, I mean, this is not something I'd necessarily go to the mat with you on, but I'm not.
I mean, and you know,
I don't.
go ahead. I was going to say,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was saying, and you know, it's not like, well, I was curious if we wanted to replace all of our coal generated energy with nuclear, we could do it for around $900 billion over 30 years by my calculations. That's pretty rough calculations.
All right.
But you think about it, and those costs would certainly go down. I think a lot of costs are going to go down as the AIs get even better. But it's not like this is an unsolvable problem. I don't want to, well, I do want to bankrupt the coal industry, but I want to make sure that people who are employed by that industry have better, safer jobs doing something else.
Right.
And I think,
well, in terms of safety, I will argue this on the other side, right? Because I'm a proponent of nuclear power. And you mentioned that the coal has killed far more. I think there might be a yes, but, there's, one big nuclear accident changes those statistics pretty quickly. Now, I'm comfortable in that we've got the regulation that's not going to happen, but nothing is foolproof. And things happen that are beyond human control. I mean, you have earthquakes and so forth that can upend a nuclear power plant. You have potential terrorist actions. You have just plain really dumb human error that can happen. So,
and that's
I don't want to say there's no risk. I'm still in the position of that's the better route to take.
And that's the great thing about the Generation 4 reactors is they are inherently they're designed to basically auto shut down essentially. But I guess,
right. But I get that. But what if the auto shutdown doesn't work?
Well, it's not an auto shut thing. It's like a designed into the very nature of the system. It's not like there's like a big red switch or something like that on the plant or something.
But again, my argument is, but what if it doesn't work?
Sure.
Because sometimes stuff just doesn't work.
Yeah, well, there's a difference between stuff that doesn't work because something that was supposed to happen doesn't, and there's between that and a system that is basically designed to automatically. Well, I guess I'm
right. No, I get it. I mean, I'm not arguing against you. I'm just
right. I understand what you're saying.
I think there ought to be sort of just an internal. I'm an internal skeptic.
Right. You can be 99.98%.
Someone says this is foolproof, this ship is unsinkable.
Right. There's a huge tail risk. Yeah, I get that. Absolutely. So, and there's still a question of what to do with all of the waste because even the newest generation plants, they say they tout the fact that, hey, it used to be that nuclear waste was radioactive for 10,000 years. Now only 300 to 500 years. And so,
right.
That's still.
Can we play that? We really got to figure out the licensing so we can play music because we should play that Sting song.
Which one is that?
We Work the Black Seam.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That was okay.
One Day in the Nuclear Age.
Dream of the Blue Turtles kind of Sting, absolutely.
Which is a defense, again, from the left of the coal mining industry against nuclear because nuclear used to be bad, but now is slightly better.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what the polling on that is anymore because you're right. I mean, but I get the sense that might have changed a little bit. I don't know. But clearly,
do you remember the Simpsons episode where Homer gets accused of sexual harassment and he has all the feminists protesting him, and they're all like walking around following with signs, and they're all at work, and his work at the nuclear power plant, holding signs, yelling at him, and they're saying we're not fans of nuclear power either. I mean that's been sort of traditional intersectionality on this kind of thing, if you will.
All right. Well, before we go, we have a little bit more time, and Jay, there's a listener who has a question for you.
Uh-oh. Okay.
It's never good, right? As a longtime listener, Amy. Amy writes, my question is in regard to your comment a while back that you're not a fan of Black History Month and Women's History Month. And Amy says, if not for decades of Black History Month and Women's History Month, how much do you really think you or I or the rest of America would really know of incredible Black and female Americans? Do you think some other option would have presented itself in the past decades to bring these incredible Americans to our attention? While I understand and agree with the principle that all Americans should be treated equally and based on our character and not our race or gender, the reality is that racism and sexism have been rampant in our history and that we should surely attempt to combat it. Millennials and Gen Z are so much more accepting of each other compared to prior generations, including us Gen Xers. And I believe Black History Month and Women's History Month and Hispanic Heritage Month contributed to that. Perhaps one day we'll all be on an even enough playing field that we won't need these month designations. I look forward to that day. So, Jay, what do you think? Any value in these months, or what do you think?
Yeah, I very much I agree with the last part, right? I think we're on the same page there. Is there any value in declaring the months? I think that to the first part, no, I think there would have been this realization of the importance of that minorities, women, Hispanic, whatever group you want to designate, has played in American history, and particularly American history, right? Because we are the most mixed up, right? Of racially diverse and really probably the most accepting and feminist forward. And maybe you can argue some places in Scandinavia or something like that would be different, but we've literally been that land of opportunity. We fought a war over slavery, right? And so I think those folks still would have been acknowledged, mentioned. I'm thinking back, right, when we were in school, and I'm not sure when Black History Month was officially recognized, right? It was sort of a quasi, but look, I certainly learned about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman before there was a Black History Month. And you can say, well, I'm weird, unusual, and that could be. I certainly heard of Simone Bolivar before there was, Latin American Hispanic. And again, he's not American, but I'm thinking of significant Latinos in world history. I certainly heard of Cesar Chavez. Now, again, I'm not necessarily a Cesar Chavez fan, but what I'm saying is I think you can recognize people of historical importance, groups of historical importance, although I'm more in favor of recognizing the people, without what is sort of a, let's say, kind of gimmicky thing, right?
So is your objection almost like an aesthetic objection here? I mean, do you just find it
is. It's partially an aesthetic objection,
okay.
A little bit.
Interesting.
There's a little bit of the it's a little bit of the soft bigotry of low expectations type argument, or the there's the eye rolling of, oh, look, we're only doing this because we have to. It's Black History Month, Pride Month, Women's History Month, whatever it is. So that's, yeah, I guess maybe it is in part aesthetic. It's also based on that same thing that I generally, and I think Americans ought to, and I think this ought to be the new ideology that replaces DEI, is stop looking at people as groups and start looking at them as individuals, because I think that's the more.
I hear you there, but I think it's also difficult when so many people even today are treated in certain ways because they are members of groups and not looked at as individuals. And so I guess to me, it feels like I understand the aesthetic thing. I see some of the gimmick. You said the words gimmicky, like the NFL and sports leagues love to put the little things in the end zone or something.
Exactly. Yeah. And racism, put it in the end zone. Well, okay, great. Good job, everybody.
But I also think that, well, if I'm some little kid and, whatever, some woman, and during Women's History Month, some young girl, and I hear the story about, I don't know, some woman who did amazing things and overcame obstacles, I could see where it'd be like, wow, that's pretty impressive. Maybe I could do that too. And so I guess I have certain aesthetic objections to a lot of any kind of promotional sort of things. Like you, I guess we're both snobs in that sense, maybe, but I feel like it doesn't do much harm. And I can see for certain folks where it would actually be pretty actively helpful. And so I don't have a problem with it, I guess. Any of them.
So here's my,
like all the months.
Two quick takes on this. One, because I'm really, the last couple of episodes, been on this kind of pop cultural reflection mode. Growing up, as we did in Gen X, we watched a lot of TV. And I remember, one of my favorite shows was Sanford and Son, also the Jeffersons. It never occurred to me that this was like a black show or a white show. It was just, I just thought, Fred Sanford was really funny, right? I mean, likewise, the Cosby Show was like the number one rated show of running through most of the 80s. Right now, look, there's some in retrospect, issues there, but I grew up with that sense of, look, I wasn't looking at one show or actors or people as this person is a representative of their race. I'm looking at them of, hey, this is a funny show, or I like this singer, person, entertainer, politician, scientist, whatever you want to say, right, on their own merits. The other thing I'll point is that what like these months remind me of, there was a book that you read, you bought when we were living together in Washington. There was a Dave Barry Slept Here, right? Dave Barry, the longtime humor columnist by Miami Herald, I think he was at. But one of the running jokes then, this was sort of just Dave Barry's funny history of America. And one of the running jokes was, as he went through each chapter of what happened, he would sort of conclude with, and of course, women and minorities continued to make many important contributions during this period. And that's somehow what I think somehow these history months strike me as. It's sort of the Dave Barry joke was, he was saying this because it was sort of the obligatory thing that he had to say. And in doing so, he was expressly almost not recognizing the actual achievements. It's like the Seinfeld gay episode of the "not that there's anything wrong with that" type thing, right? It's this obligatory.
Well, sure, and
sort of
I
putting
think
things in a different box, and I guess that's what I mean by the gimmicky sort of thing of oh, well, we'll have a Black History Month and or whatever month, and also sometimes these months tend to be taken over by sort of an activist kind of crowd, and sometimes a lot of the history, the stuff that's getting pushed is nonsense. So,
but that said, I'm sure you're not in favor of some of the, I guess I will call extremes to which the Trump administration has gone to anti-DEI historical history in the U.S., but in various ways.
No, well, like I said, the stuff, and I'm still trying to figure out, right? Was it accidental, or if it was something just in the one instrument that was used to screen out the DEI stuff on the websites and all that. But no, I mean, look, of course we ought to honor Jackie Robinson. That's sort of that's my I don't see. And again, maybe you'll say I'm naive, and maybe I am, but I don't see any political goal or gain in to say, well, when we talk about getting rid of DEI, which I think is a pernicious type of ideology that puts groups over individuals, then this is how they want to go about it. To me, as I said, the way to do it is quite the opposite. Is we pay more attention to the Jackie Robinsons, who were great individuals. And it's not a matter of, oh, I'm celebrating this person because of his race. I'm celebrating because of what he did. Now, part of what he did, obviously, was related to his race, right? He had to be the one who overcame those barriers. But that's a different thing from saying we're honoring someone because, this month, because this is the amount of melanin they have in their skin.
Got it. Okay. Well, on that note, I think we should probably close, but we have.
Well, can I say one more thing?
You sure can. You could say too.
Sort of alluded to this in his first term at one point. In that, and it was sort of a goofy, silly kind of thing, because I don't know that he necessarily. But in talking about it, he said it was talking about Frederick Douglass, which again, if people should read more about Frederick Douglass, because he was an amazing human being, and what he did, I think would blow the minds of most Americans today. But Trump said something about Frederick Douglass. You're going to be hearing a lot more from him coming up. And I'm not sure he entirely knew who Frederick Douglass was, or that he wasn't really putting out any new material. But I think that's the antidote, right? Is we look for excellence and greatness in human beings. We don't say as like the Joe Biden thing, if I'm looking for the most qualified black woman I can find, right? That's the DEI. The antithesis is I'm looking for the best in human achievement. And when we do that, I think you naturally see that best in human achievement is spread out amongst races, amongst sexes, amongst genders, whatever. So there's my soapbox. But
Gotcha.
She asked.
That
was a good question.
Yeah, I'd say less spread out than it would be if there weren't certain structural barriers in place that systematically disadvantage people of certain groups and women, I would argue, but that's another whole issue anyway. But we do have a lot, one thing we didn't get to that I'm eager to get to on the midweek show, the Alien Enemies Act. I've been itching to talk about that and everything with that, and we're going to do that. I also very much want to talk about the administration, what it's doing to universities that aren't interested in complying with its anti-DEI, anti-wokeness sort of things. And maybe, Jay, we'll have time, you and I will get into a little bit about liberalism and how we see the left, right, and all that kind of stuff. We'll see. But a bunch of stuff coming up, my point is, on the midweek show. We're looking forward to doing it. But before we get to that, hey, if there's anything about this episode that you particularly liked, disliked, or have a question about, let us know. We're at mail@politicsguys.com. Also Facebook and X, and as always, links are in the show notes. And as well, there's our disco. We don't have a disco forum. Maybe we should.
We should start one.
I don't know. I know you don't want to see that, but a Discord forum for supporters. I'm on that all the time. And of course, when you become a supporter, you get ad-free versions of everything we release. You get that full midweek episode as opposed to just that 15-minute kind of preview thing. Get to be on the Discord, bunch of stuff. We hope you'll consider it. As always, I put the link to that in the show notes, and it really is hugely important. And as always, if you want to support us, but you're not in a position to do so, but you want that full midweek episode, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it helps us a lot if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And before we go, as always, very special thanks to our executive producers, Will Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, David Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.